Hello, my name's Ryan,
Hello, I'm Samantha.
I'm Michelle.
and today we'll be doing discussion 6, week 11. So, question 1, according to Ki Young Park, what motivations do Korean Americans have for becoming a Christian and attending a church? What are the three types of Korean Christian Park observes, and how does she describe them? So, on page 186, I found the church has become a place where people confirm their individual achievements in life. Equally important because of the mass rural to urban immigration, there are many hometown churches in large cities, Bible study groups, visiting service teams, overnight and dawn prayers, mass prayers for national security, public confessions, and occasional aid for the life crisis are some of the major achieve activities of these churches which attract Koreans.
Yeah. Um, on page 184, um, it says church serves as an institution for socializing, seeking status, and meeting physical and spiritual needs for immigrants, according to some scholars. And then um, on page 189, it says some Koreans attend church primarily for social reasons and without serious commitment to faith. Others are deeply religious. Um, I think that I feel like it's saying like the same thing. Like I feel like there's like half and half. There's like some that like were like are religious and they would go, but then others would go in the sense that it was like a place for them to socialize or um to like talk to other like fellow like Koreans like and stuff. And then on page 190 it says that there were three different ways to be a Korean Christian in the US, and it says a convenient churchgoer, to be born again, and to be critical Christian. So yeah.
I wanted to talk about how on page 186 it says that the Christianity plays like a large role in the life of the Korean American community, and like it goes in starts talking about how some landlords or apartment shares provide discounts to Korean American like Christians, and even sometimes in situations where Korean Buddhists are involved with like other Korean Christians, like they're willing to convert in order to like ease familial tension. That was on page 186. And I also wanted to add about how another motivation would be how how they work in like small businesses, and the church is a good place for them to network. You know how they are involved in cares and that little credit little thing that they do. And also, aside from the small businesses, it's also a place where they can talk about like, oh, what jobs are available and other business information.
I agree. The
Yeah.
convenient churchgoer on page 190 is the most popular category among immigrants who go to church. And then they kind of believe they're searching for life experiences rather than a set of beliefs. And they go to church basically to see fellow Koreans and speak Korean without necessarily appreciating that church as a religious institution. It's more of like a place of belonging for Koreans to see each other.
Hmm. Are we gonna go over the three?
Yeah, I just went over the first one.
Okay. Well, for my on my notes, it talks about born again Christians, which is the second one, and these Christians are like very religious. I don't know how else to explain it. It talks about it on page 190. but these people are like very about the religion. They
Yeah, I
see
agree.
they see more, it's more than, you know, just going to church and like creating like relationships and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's about like being a part of like, you know, being kind to your neighbor and like remembering your parents' birthday and like the little things in life and not just being a Christian and going to church.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, and then the last category would be what the critical Korean Christians,
Hmm.
and this category was like primarily like it was their primary concern today in institutional survival, and then it says some fighting for power over who gets to lead the church. So I kind of got confused on this section, like what really like or how like it was different from like the other two categories that it was talking about. Um, what I got over it, it was just that like itself is that like it was more about like some Koreans like kind of fighting for power like within in the church. And like it was explaining how like elderly individuals were talking about how like instead of them actually going to church and um being like kind to one another and actually having like a set beliefs, it was more about they just care more about power over that, and they just couldn't like believe it, like that was the reason why some were like going to church.
I agree. On page 184, it says scholars agree that the church serves as immigrants' main institution for seeking status, socializing, and meeting physical and spiritual needs. And it just really it highlights status. I think a lot of them just wanted power.
Yeah. um Really quick for the I know we went over this one, but for the convenient like convenient Korean churchgoers, on page 186 it said something about how like it says Christian churches contribute significantly to the construction of a Korean American culture, while Buddhist church emphasize the preservation of traditional Korean culture. I thought that was interesting because um obviously it's saying like Buddhism was more of like keeping their cult like the Korean culture, but since like they were coming to America and it was it's a different society, different values, like it's interesting to me how some of them like did convert to Christianity. um Kind of I feel like it was mostly because they kind of start getting into like the American views. So being a Buddhist was not like it like is said for the critical Korean Christian like category. Like in a sense they saw it as like, okay, if we don't like convert whatever, like we're just not gonna like make it in society, or like kind of like grow within to like have
So you're
like
saying like to
something, or
adapt
like
to like American culture?
yeah,
I see. No,
yeah,
that I agree with that. They said that in the beginning of class, like when we started this class.
yeah,
A lot of them went to church to like, understand the American culture.
yeah.
I can see that
So it's
though.
just it's
I agree.
yeah, because like you wouldn't think that like well, there's like obviously Christians that are like Christian, right? They go because they have set beliefs, but like in the sense of like how like some like for instance like how some of these Koreans, like I can't remember what page it was, but it was talking about how there was this one man who didn't even consider himself Christian. Like he was just going because again it was a place of where they can go socialize, speak to other Koreans in Korean, and kind of like just to like kind in a sense it's like a support group instead of actually going for like church. But I just think it's interesting how they decided to go with like a Christian church, or like make another like Christian church just like to have that setting of conversation. Yeah.
No, I agree. I thought it was interesting too.
Yeah, I think about how it's kind of like not only a Korean thing, because I know that in like the church that like my grandparents go to, like it's similar where they have like it's a place where they could see other people in the community that speak Spanish, and they have like English classes there and like citizenship like help kind of stuff. So I made that connection while I was reading.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um yeah, one thing like going along with like kind of that, because I mean you have to like, not that you have to, but it just brings to question like, okay, like kind of like to distinguish like who is going to church for like actually like the set beliefs or not, and like who's going, just because they talk about all these things of how to kind of like survive in like the society like here in America. On page 196 it says, Korean Christians appear to perceive God as a generous spirit who is sympathetic toward the incompleteness of human beings. God is always understanding of human desire rather than a strict judge of behavior, which I think it's interesting because the last part where it says desire rather than a strict judge of behavior, which in reality like that's not like what like Christianity is. It's more, it's about character, it's about who you are. And then they see it as like like reversed, of how like, oh no, like he understands our desires and like he like will help us in that, but not like in the strict behavior. So there it kind of like contradicts like, okay, you're going to church, but you're not going to church for this, or for like the actual set beliefs, or for what like the religion is. So I just think that like that's interesting how they just found it within a church, like instead of like creating or making a group that didn't involve Christianity and such. I don't know, I just think it's interesting.
Do you guys have anything else for the question?
Mm-mm.
No.
All right, let's move on to question 2. So question 2, according to Helen Lee's article, what accounts for the silent exodus of second generation Korean American youth of the churches? What are some of the issues facing Korean American churches that Lee writes about? What differing opinions regarding appear in Lee's essay?
Okay, so on page 1, Lee talks about how a silent exodus of the church raised young people who find their immigrant churches irrelevant, culturally stifling, and ill-equipped to develop them spiritually for a life in the multicultural 1990s. So I think that was like her definition of what a silent exodus is. And
Mhm.
um, an issue I wanted to bring up was how I don't remember if this was a quote, but on page 1, it talks about how the church was like a parent thing. There was nothing for the children. Like, there wasn't a children's program, or like there wasn't anything in English for like these Korean American children. So they kind of felt a disconnect from that since it was all in Korean and all like, in adult language, like in a language that they can't understand.
Yeah, I also have on page 51 Daniel Lee quotes. It didn't have enough energy or time to focus on the second generation because they kind of only cared about the first generation and making them feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. um on page 50, it also mentioned about not having like a learning outlet like on the Bible and Christianity. So it seems like the church was like obviously it was there, right? And like parents who already knew like about like the Bible and what Christianity was, like it was just set like that, but they never like put apart like, a learning class or something to like learn about like Christianity itself. So I think that that's like another reason like why a lot of like the second generation, like it kind of like wanted to stop going to church, because it's something that they didn't know much about. So I could see where like they would feel kind of lost in attending like services and just being there, but not knowing exactly like, okay, like this is what you know the Bible says, or this is what Christianity is. um but one like theme that I found like while reading this, I most for the majority of like the second generation, it was mostly like they stopped going to church was because of like the language. Like even though like yes, it was like their native tongue and like their parents like spoke it, but because they're here in America, like obviously like once we step outside our homes, like it's all English, right? Society, everybody speaks English. So like in learning, like not learning, but just having to speak English like every day outside, like you get used to that. I mean, from my experience, like being able to speak another language, like it's always English. So you kind of get used to just always speaking English, whether you speak a different language at home. So like in reading this, like I felt like yeah, like that, even though like it is your native language, English just becomes such a comfortable language, and like hearing it and stuff, that sometimes like you even lose part of your native of language. So like going to church for them, and like um partly like they partly understood and probably not, like that's why they left, and they went to other churches that had English services because they felt more comfortable.
Hmm.
I agree. Language was one of the biggest things. This is just like an opinion of mine. I just kind of like when I was reading it, I thought of in one of the readings, it said like the younger generations are not so adept, just be committed to a church. There are other things that will satisfy their cultural needs. I kind of just seen it as like maybe church for them was like a old person thing because like they understand the American culture better than their parents. So I feel like there's like more simulation and they can understand things besides the church, which kind of like led them away from the church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just something I thought of.
Yeah, because for like the older people, the church is like all they have. Like that's,
Mhm.
and then like for like the children, well, I think it was talking about how it was in that last reading, I think, where they're talking about how the older generations didn't have like the Koreatowns, nor did they have like
Like
K-pop, I think.
K-pop, I think they said.
Yeah, yeah, like in the mainstream, like they could see that now and like it's everywhere. But like before, like it was just the church. That was all they had.
On page 53, it says parents also assume that if you just sent your kids to church through high school, that they would come out as good Christians. However, due to the lack of teaching resources in Asian churches or the decision to conduct services and teaching times in Asian languages, the quality of spiritual instruction the young people received often falls short of their needs. Parents thought their kids would go to church in college, which the author believes is to be a native thought. Like parents, I feel like Korean parents and just all Asian parents, first generation, sorry, just kind of assume their parents, like their kids would follow.
Yeah. But I mean, honestly, I do think that it has to do with like how you said, Samantha, like the older generation, all they had at the time was just church. But because now,
Hmm.
we see, Korean culture coming, into like the US, and like, through media, and like, it's becoming like a bigger thing. Like they have that aside from church. So I think, and also just because obviously they know English, they know more about like the American culture, they kind of that they found like another um how would I explain it? Like not group, but it's just like another setting where they feel comfortable and they know that they can like, explore their culture in a different way rather than, you know, combining it with Christianity, how like their parents, um, always go to church and like all these things and they do everything, on Sunday and all these things, like, and instead of that they found it within through like media, and yeah.
Hmm.
Some of the issues was on page 51. The church wants to meet people's age requirements, marital requirements, and there's is very strict for second generation or beyond that to actually become someone important in the church or like a pastor.
Yeah.
No, I agree with Samantha too. I think it was just like a lot of Western ideas, that kind of like influenced the second generation.
Yeah. um One thing that I did find interesting, because it talked about like Chinese churches and also like Japanese churches. So on page 51 it says Chinese churches have lost a lot of Chinese American to their churches due to not having an English service. And then on page 52 it says Japanese churches are fine because they don't mind having an English service. You never see a full on Japanese service. So I thought that was interesting, like in terms of like simulation, because I know like for Chinese churches, it explained how like they want to keep their culture, they want to keep their language, so they focus more on having services that are all like in Chinese rather than English. And then you have, Japanese churches having full on like English services, but not Japanese services. So I thought that was interesting because it's like the total opposite. And then I feel like with like the Korean church, like it's kind of like, struggling in that sense of like they want to keep it like have Korean like certain full on Korean services, and then now like having to have services in English because of like the second generation. So it's just interesting, like how different like each church is, like how one is like struggling and how like the other isn't, and like how one is kind of like in the middle trying to like figure out like, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to have both services, or just full on just change to just full on English? So it was just interesting having to read like the struggles within that between like the three churches.
Yeah, I remember that. They didn't really explain exactly why that was, which I kind of found interesting. Like Japanese, they said like for 4 generations, they had like 4 generations of um, Japanese Americans in their church instead of like Koreans with only like 1 or 2 generations.
Okay. um and then also like I can't remember what page specifically, but it also said about how like um the second generation wanted like church to feel like they want church to feel comfortable and be a comfortable setting. And that looks like by having a service in English, and then as well as the second generation wanting the blessing from the first generation. um but it seemed like the way that it explained it, it was that there's some like first generations that don't agree with second generation and like how they want them to lead the church. So I also found that interesting because then like here we look again at like, okay, like you have older um people in charge of church, and then you have like the second generation of pastors like wanting to lead the church in a different direction. So I also found that interesting, and that's like another issue that they have going on within the church. And it's just interesting because they want to lead and they want uh to just like lead in a different way, but they also just want the first generation to like give them their blessing. But even that's kind of hard for the first generation to give that power over to the second generation.
Yeah, I think that was on 52. I'm looking through my notes right now. Yeah, it says like they may tend to feel uncomfortable in both Korean and Caucasian churches.
Yeah.
Are you guys ready to move on to question 3?
Yes.
Okay. So, question 3, based on the readings, what social functions, services, support experiences does the church have in Korean American communities? How has Christianity and the church been detrimental and beneficial to Korean Americans and to immigrants? I feel like this is like kind of repeating what we said in question 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I like separated it by like author, and for Park, I wrote that I got off page 184 that the church serves as immigrants' main institution for socializing, seeking status, and meeting physical and spiritual needs. So I thought that summed it up pretty well in that article, in that reading.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I categorize it in social functions, detrimental, and then beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
My social functions, just like Bible study groups, visiting service teams, overnight and dawn prayers, small business activities with the Kai, the Loan Institute, and then like giving out like lower rent, and then those are kind of like the benefits you can get.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's detrimental was in the silent exodus from Korean American churches as younger um, passioners find community elsewhere. And then this is just saying like the younger generations are not so adept just being committed to church. There are other things that will satisfy their cultural needs. And then one of the beneficials I have is in the linked lives in Yu and Kim's chapter 6 on page 175. It says, for many first generation Korean Americans, the church is a sanctuary from everyday experience from racism and cultural barriers, and a comfortable place to interact with other Koreans. And then it just kind of says, like, from 1903, the churches were like the biggest social organization for Korean American communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In Linked Lives, on page 176, it also says the church provides critical social networks and support and has the potential to help Korean families sort out their expectations and plan consciously and realistically for the care of aging family members. Um, so by that, like, they turn to like church because you would have like pastors, like the pastor's wife, elders, and like other deacons, and they would, take their time to help elders who like either didn't know English and such, and they would help them with health and like social needs. and that is just like, explaining health, legal issues, and at times like transporting them to like, go to like doctor appointments, or things like that. So I found that interesting. um Again, it's they just turn to church, for help in how to navigate, this is like in society. um and then one thing that I found interesting, and it was on page 176 as well, it says, immigrant parents state that they want to live independently. In order for this to work, they would turn to the church community. So, for like some of them, like stated, like we want to live independently. We don't like want like our kids living with us and like having to worry about that. So again, they would turn to their church for support and like how to navigate that. So
Hmm.
Mhm.
Well, in the UN Kim reading, I took note about on page 178, it talked about how it's beneficial because the church is beneficial because it's a great place to organize around issues affecting their community, but it's detrimental in the way that in the specific quote he was talking about how all the church all the church talks about are gay issues or abortion issues, and when they could be focusing on other things, other issues like immigration or healthcare issues. So that was one thing. And in the last reading, by Cachero, I wanted to take note that the church was once the church once served as centers of community for immigrant families, but I feel like for like the Korean Americans, it causes them to grapple with their like dual identity, and it causes like a tension between their Korean heritage and their American upbringing. So that's a detriment to them.
yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.